I was standing ankle-deep in my own pool, skimmer drifting in lazy circles, when I heard the sharp click of my backyard gate unlocking behind me. I turned, already annoyed, expecting one of my kids sneaking in for a surprise splash. Instead, it was a stranger heel sinking into my grass, clipboard clutched to her chest, smiling like she'd already won something. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't even bother with a hello. She looked straight at my pool and said, "Your pool violates HOA safety standards. We'll need immediate compliance." My stomach tightened, but not from fear, from disbelief. Because my house isn't in the HOA, it never has been. My grandparents built this place decades before that subdivision existed, and the county boundary literally curves around my property like it's allergic to their rules. It's documented. Stamped. Undeniable. But none of that mattered to her. Within a week, my mailbox filled with official-looking notices. Violations. Daily fines. Threats of a lien, all over a pool they claimed was somehow theirs to control. That's when I realized arguing wouldn't save me. Paperwork would. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I live in a quiet pocket of land just outside the subdivision in Red Willow Ridge, a place most people drive past without thinking twice. From the street, it looks like I belong to the HOA. Their sidewalks wrap around 3 sides of my property. Their identical mailboxes line the road. Their street signs frame my driveway. If you didn't know the history, you'd assume I was just another homeowner under their rules. That assumption is exactly how all of this started. My grandparents bought this land in the late 1970s, back when Red Willow Ridge was nothing but open dirt, fence posts, and wind. There were no decorative entry signs, no rule books, no monthly dues, just land and a small house they built themselves, piece by piece, the kind of place that grows roots because people put real work into it. When developers arrived years later, they didn't buy our property, they built around it. Roads curved, lots were adjusted, and when the HOA was officially created, the boundary lines bent cleanly around my grandparents' land like it wasn't even an option. That bend matters more than people realize. It means I am not and never have been part of the HOA, no contract, no signature, no obligation. The county records show it clearly, the subdivision plats show it clearly, and even the HOA's own incorporation documents quietly admit it. My property sits just outside their reach, legally untouched by their authority. I kept it that way on purpose. When my grandparents passed and the house became mine, I had options. I could have sold. I could have folded myself into the subdivision and accepted HOA membership like everyone else. Instead, I chose independence, no dues creeping up every year, no approval forms for paint colors, no one counting how many inches my grass grew after a rainy week. I wanted a home, not a permission slip. Life stayed simple that way. I worked, came home, waved politely to neighbors, and stayed out of HOA business. I paid my taxes. I followed county law. I didn't cause problems. For a long time, that was enough. The pool came later, after years of saving. It wasn't some flashy showpiece meant to impress anyone. It was practical, safe, built for family. I pulled county permits. I paid inspectors. I passed every requirement they put in front of me. The fence met code. The gate latched properly. The signage was exactly where it was supposed to be. Every step was documented. When it was finished, it changed everything in the best way. Summer evenings turned into something we looked forward to instead of something we rushed through. My kids lived in that pool when school was out. Dinner happened later because nobody wanted to get out. Music played. Laughter echoed. It felt like the kind of normal life people are always chasing. That peace lasted right up until Marilyn Kessler noticed me. Marilyn wasn't officially the HOA head, but everyone treated her like she was. She walked the neighborhood every morning like she was on patrol, clipboard tucked under her arm, eyes scanning for violations. People joked about her, but never too loudly. You could feel the way neighbors adjusted their behavior when she was around. Trash cans moved quicker. Garage doors closed faster. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Marilyn had a reputation for knowing the rules better than anyone else and reminding you of them whether you asked or not. To her, the HOA wasn't a community. It was a jurisdiction, and power, once tasted, has a way of needing constant reinforcement. At first, I was just background scenery to her, a house near the edge, an odd boundary line, something that didn't fit neatly into her mental map. But the pool changed that. It was visible. It was active. It was something she hadn't approved. And to someone like Marilyn, that was unacceptable. She started slowing down near my fence during her walks, stopping longer than necessary, writing things down. Watching? I noticed it, but I didn't think much of it. After all, I wasn't breaking any rules that applied to me. I assumed she'd eventually get bored and move on to someone whose trash can was 2 inches too far from the curb. I was wrong. To Marilyn, my backyard wasn't just a pool. It was a challenge, a reminder that there was one piece of land in her carefully controlled world that didn't answer to her clipboard. And instead of respecting that boundary, she decided to erase it. That was the moment my quiet little pocket of independence became her next target. The first letter showed up on a Monday morning, folded so stiff it felt more like a warning than mail. The envelope was stamped urgent in bold red ink, the kind meant to make your pulse jump before you even open it. Inside was a neatly typed list of violations that made no sense the moment I started reading. Fence color, not approved. Gate latch height, non-compliant. Visibility standards violated. Every single rule referenced HOA bylaws I had never agreed to, never signed, and never fallen under. At the bottom was a line that made me snort out loud: daily fines will begin immediately until compliance is achieved. I actually laughed. Standing there in my kitchen, letter in hand, I laughed like this was a badly written joke someone slipped into my mailbox by mistake. I tossed it on the counter and went on with my day. That confidence lasted exactly 48 hours. The second letter arrived Wednesday. Same envelope, same urgent stamp. Same tone, but sharper. The fines were now itemized, written out day by day, stacked like a countdown. The wording was no longer polite or corrective. It was authoritative, like I had already lost an argument I didn't know I was in. By Friday, the third letter came. This one didn't mention fence color at all. It jumped straight to consequences. Liens. Enforcement action. Legal escalation. The language was deliberate, chosen to scare someone into compliance before they had time to think. It wasn't a reminder anymore. It was a threat. That was the moment the laughter stopped. Marilyn hadn't just crossed a line. She had decided the line didn't exist and sprinted straight past it without looking back. And if that wasn't enough, she escalated again before I even had time to respond. She took it public. I found out when my phone started buzzing with messages from neighbors I barely spoke to. Someone asked if everything was okay. Someone else asked if my pool was safe. Confused, I opened the HOA Facebook group, a place I had never bothered joining because, again, I wasn't part of the HOA. And there it was. Photos of my backyard, close-ups of my pool fence. A shot angled just right to make the latch look questionable if you didn't know what you were looking at. Marilyn had posted them with a long caption about community safety and children at risk, carefully avoiding the fact that the pool wasn't on HOA property at all. She framed it like a public service announcement, like she was bravely stepping in to protect the neighborhood. The comments piled up fast. People I didn't know suddenly had strong opinions about my home. Some repeated Marilyn's words almost verbatim. Others asked why I hadn't just followed the rules. A few defended me cautiously, pointing out that my property might not be under HOA control, but those comments were drowned out quickly. It was easier to side with the loudest voice than question it. I watched the narrative take shape in real time. I wasn't a homeowner anymore. I was a problem. Marilyn responded to every comment with confidence, reinforcing the idea that she had authority. She talked about bylaws, about enforcement, about consequences. She never once acknowledged the boundary issue, not once. It was like she had decided reality was optional as long as enough people believed her version instead. Then she made her biggest move yet. She announced an emergency HOA meeting, not a discussion, not a review, an emergency meeting called specifically to address what she described as unauthorized private amenities within HOA jurisdiction. She used words like liability and exposure. She implied urgency. She made it sound like something had to be done immediately before someone got hurt. I read that post 3 times, slow and careful. That's when it clicked. This was never about the pool, not really. The fence could have been perfect, the permits flawless, the safety unquestionable. None of it mattered. What mattered was that my property existed just outside her control, that there was a space she couldn't regulate, couldn't fine, couldn't correct with a clipboard and a threat. To someone like Marilyn, that kind of independence isn't neutral, it's offensive. I thought about responding publicly. I typed out replies and deleted them. I considered posting the county maps right there in the comments and ending it in one move. But something stopped me. Marilyn wasn't looking for a conversation. She was building momentum. And momentum doesn't collapse just because someone disagrees politely. If I jumped in too early, it would turn into noise. Back and forth, opinions, drama, exactly the environment she thrived in. So I stayed quiet. I let the post sit. I let the letters stack up. I let Marilyn keep talking. Because if she was going to claim authority she didn't have, I wanted her to do it loudly, clearly, and in front of as many witnesses as possible. That emergency meeting wasn't a threat to me anymore. It was an opportunity. And from that moment on, I stopped reacting and started preparing. I tried reason first, because that's what normal people do when a misunderstanding spirals. I sat down at my kitchen table, reread every letter she'd sent, and drafted an email that couldn't have been calmer if I'd written it half asleep. No accusations, no attitude, just facts. I explained that my property was not part of the HOA. I attached a copy of my county pool permit, complete with inspection approvals and dates. I mentioned politely that all work had been done to county code and passed without issue. I even added a line thanking her for her concern about safety, just to make it clear I wasn't looking for a fight. Then I hit send and waited. Her response came less than an hour later, one sentence. No greeting, no signature. Everyone here answers to the HOA. I stared at the screen longer than I probably should have, not because I was confused, but because the confidence behind that sentence was unsettling. There was no curiosity in it, no doubt. No interest in verifying anything I had said. It wasn't a disagreement. It was a declaration. That was the moment something shifted for me. Up until then, I'd still been operating under the assumption that this was a misunderstanding fueled by ego. That if I laid everything out cleanly and calmly, reason would eventually break through. But that sentence told me exactly who I was dealing with. Marilyn wasn't confused. She had decided. In her mind, authority didn't come from documents or boundaries. It came from repetition and volume. If she said it enough times, loudly enough, in enough places, it would become true. And if someone pushed back, she would simply say it again, firmer, until they folded. I closed my laptop and sat there in silence, listening to the faint splash of water from the pool outside. My kids were laughing. The normal sounds of a normal day. And I realized something important. If I kept trying to explain myself to Marilyn, I would lose time, energy, and eventually peace. Because people like her don't debate facts. They overwrite them. That afternoon, I got in my truck and drove to the county recorder's office. The building was nothing special. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a waiting area that smelled faintly of old paper and dust. It was the kind of place people only visit when something really matters. I took a number, sat down, and waited my turn, watching names scroll across a small screen. When I finally reached the counter, I didn't rant. I didn't vent. I just explained that I needed certified copies of every document related to my property and the surrounding subdivision. The clerk nodded like she'd heard versions of this story before and disappeared into the back. What came back changed everything. First were the original survey maps from the late 1970s showing my grandparents' property clearly outlined, separate and untouched. Then I spent the next 2 days buried in paperwork, the kind most people never see unless something has gone seriously wrong. I went back to the county recorder's office early the following morning, before the line even formed, and asked for everything. Not summaries, not copies pulled from a screen. Certified records, stamped, sealed, undeniable. They brought out the original survey from the late 1970s, yellowed at the edges, but still sharp in detail. My grandparents' property was outlined clearly, long before any subdivision lines existed. Then came the subdivision plats from years later, where the HOA boundary curved around my lot like a deliberate omission. No overlap. No ambiguity. Just a clean, intentional exclusion. Next were the HOA's own incorporation filings. That part almost made me smile. In black and white, their documents confirmed what I already knew. The jurisdiction began at the edge of my fence and stopped there. No shared amenities. No grandfather clauses pulling me in. No authority over my land at all. I asked the clerk to certify every single document. She raised an eyebrow at the growing stack but didn't question it. When she pressed the seal into the paper and stamped each page, it felt less like bureaucracy and more like armor being fitted piece by piece. Back at home, I cleared the dining table and spread everything out. I bought a thick binder, the kind meant for serious work, and organized it with care. Each section had a purpose: original property history, subdivision boundaries, HOA filings, county permits, inspection approvals. Every document placed in chronological order, every tab labeled clearly so nothing could be missed or misunderstood. This wasn't about overwhelming anyone with paper. It was about telling a story that could only end one way. While I worked, Marilyn kept going. More letters arrived. The language got harsher. Deadlines shortened. The fines climbed higher. Each envelope sounded heavier when it hit the mailbox, like it was daring me to react. And online, she grew louder. More posts, more comments, more declarations about safety and compliance and consequences. I didn't respond to a single one. I didn't comment. I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct her. To anyone watching from the outside, it probably looked like I was folding, like I was letting her run the narrative unchecked. That was fine, because every threat she sent, every public claim she made, was another statement of authority she didn't have, another assertion that could be measured against documented reality. Another brick in the wall she was building around herself, layer by layer, without realizing she was sealing the door behind her. People like Marilyn thrive on reaction. They feed on arguments, on visible resistance, on the emotional back and forth that lets them frame themselves as the reasonable enforcer dealing with a difficult homeowner. Silence frustrates them. Silence forces them to talk more, to commit harder, to say things that can't be walked back later. I wanted her fully committed. By the time the emergency HOA meeting drew closer, my binder was complete. It sat on the table, thick and heavy, pages snug in clear sleeves, tabs sticking out like quiet signals. I flipped through it once more, not because I needed reassurance, but because preparation calms nerves better than confidence ever could. I knew exactly what each document proved. I knew how they connected. I knew what questions they answered before they were even asked. This wasn't just proof that my pool was legal. It was proof that Maryland had stepped far outside her jurisdiction and kept going, confidently, publicly, and repeatedly. If this ever reached a courtroom, that binder wouldn't just defend me, it would document a pattern. And that was the real power. The binder wasn't something I planned to wave around in anger. It wasn't a dramatic prop. It was patient, silent, heavy with facts, waiting for the right moment to be opened. By then, the meeting was already scheduled. The room was booked. The neighbors were buzzing. Marilyn was preparing her presentation, convinced she was about to put me in my place. She had no idea that every word she planned to say had already been answered, neatly filed, and ready to end her authority in one motion. The binder wasn't just evidence. It was a trap, and she was walking straight into it. The night of the meeting, the community hall was fuller than I had ever seen it. Cars lined the street, headlights washing over the building as people filtered inside, drawn less by concern and more by curiosity. HOA meetings usually struggled to pull a handful of residents. This one had energy. People could sense drama before a single word was spoken. I walked in quietly and took a seat near the back, the binder resting on the chair beside me like extra weight I didn't mind carrying. Around me, neighbors whispered, glanced over their shoulders, and pretended not to stare. A few nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Marilyn's version of events had clearly traveled far. She stood at the front of the room already, clipboard replaced by confidence, posture straight, expression tight with satisfaction. Behind her, a projector hummed to life, throwing a bright slideshow onto the wall. The first slide read, "Community Safety and Compliance," in bold letters. It looked official. That was her favorite look. She didn't wait for the room to settle before starting. Marilyn spoke like a prosecutor delivering an opening statement. She talked about shared responsibility, about protecting property values, about the danger of unchecked private modifications. She used words like liability and exposure, letting them hang in the air long enough to make people uneasy. Slide after slide appeared behind her, stock photos of children, fences highlighted in red circles, arrows pointing to imagined flaws. Every few sentences, she glanced around the room, measuring reactions. Nods encouraged her. Silence emboldened her. She was in her element. Then she brought up my address. She clicked to a slide showing a photo of my backyard, taken from just the right angle to make the fence look questionable if you didn't know better. She gestured toward it and said, calmly and clearly, "This pool is under HOA authority and it does not meet our safety standards." The room murmured. That sentence landed heavier than all the others combined. It wasn't framed as an opinion. It wasn't a concern. It was a declaration. And I felt the shift immediately. People leaned forward. Pens moved. Someone whispered my name. I raised my hand once. Marilyn paused, clearly annoyed at the interruption, and nodded toward me like she was granting a favor. I stood up slowly, keeping my voice steady. "Can you show documentation proving that my property is part of the HOA?" The question cut through the room in a way none of her slides had. Marilyn smiled, the kind of smile that assumes agreement is inevitable. "Everyone here is part of the HOA," she said. "That's how the subdivision works." "I understand that's what you believe," I replied, still calm. "I'm asking for documentation. A deed, a plat map. Anything that shows my lot falls within HOA boundaries." Her smile tightened. She repeated herself, louder this time, like volume could replace evidence. She talked about common areas, about assumed jurisdiction, about how long she had lived there. Each word sounded confident, but none of them answered the question. So I reached down, picked up the binder, and walked to the front of the room. The sound it made when I set it on the table was subtle, but it carried. A dull, solid thump. The kind that makes people look up. "I'd like to submit documentation," I said. I opened the binder and flipped to the first tab. Original Property Survey. I laid it flat so everyone could see the boundary lines, my lot outlined clearly, separate from the subdivision that would come later. Then I turned to the next section, Subdivision Plats. HOA Incorporation Filings. County certified maps with stamps and seals that caught the light. I didn't rush. I didn't explain more than necessary. I let the documents speak. "This property predates the HOA," I said. "When the subdivision was created, the boundary was drawn around my land. These are certified county records. My property has never been under HOA jurisdiction." The room went quiet. Marilyn stared at the papers like they were written in another language. For a moment, I thought she might back down, admit a mistake, move on. Instead, she snapped. "These documents are fake," she said sharply. "They have to be." "This makes no sense." A few people gasped. Someone laughed nervously. Accusing someone of fraud in a room full of witnesses isn't something you can take back easily. I closed the binder gently. "If you believe that," I said, "you're welcome to verify them." She didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone, turned away from the microphone, and made the call that would end her authority for good. She told the dispatcher there was fraud happening, that HOA documents were being forged, that someone was interfering with official HOA business. When she hung up, she folded her arms and looked at me like she'd just delivered a final blow. I sat back down, because at that point, the meeting wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the truth, and the truth was already on its way. Marilyn thought accusing me of forgery would scare me into backing down. In her mind, it was the nuclear option, the kind of accusation that makes someone fold out of fear of legal consequences. She said it loudly, confidently, in front of an entire room, certain she had just exposed a lie. What she didn't realize was that she had just handed control to someone who didn't care about her confidence. She called the police. The room buzzed as people whispered and shifted in their seats. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked excited, like they were watching something they'd talk about for years. Marilyn stood, with her arms crossed, chin raised, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who thought the outcome was already decided. I stayed seated. About 20 minutes later, 2 officers walked in, one older, steady, the kind who moved slowly but noticed everything. The other younger, quieter, eyes already scanning the room. The chatter died instantly. Marilyn rushed toward them before anyone else could speak. She launched into her story without taking a breath. Fraud, forged documents, interference with HOA authority. She talked fast, stacking accusations on top of each other, convinced that urgency alone would validate her claims. The older officer held up a hand. "Let's slow down," he said. "What exactly is the emergency?" That question alone shifted the tone. Marilyn hesitated, then gestured toward me and the binder. "Those documents," she said. "They're fake. He's trying to undermine the HOA." The officer turned to me. "Sir, can I see the paperwork?" I stood, carried the binder over, and handed it to him without a word. He flipped through it carefully, page by page. He checked the seals, ran his fingers over the embossed stamps, compared dates. The younger officer leaned in, reading along, occasionally exchanging glances with his partner. They didn't rush, and that silence was louder than anything Marilyn had said all night. After a few minutes, the older officer stepped aside and made a phone call. He spoke quietly, confirming names, dates, parcel numbers. When he came back, his expression had changed, not dramatic, just firm. "These records are authentic," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the room. "This property is not part of the HOA. It never has been." You could feel the air shift. Marilyn opened her mouth, then closed it. "That can't be right," she said. "Everyone here," the younger officer cut in. "Ma'am, this is a civil matter. And based on these documents, You don't have authority over his property." The older officer nodded. "Continuing to send violation notices or threaten liens on a property outside your jurisdiction could be considered harassment." That word landed hard. Harassment. A few people in the room exchanged looks. Someone near the front let out a quiet laugh they immediately tried to hide. Others leaned back in their chairs, suddenly reevaluating everything they had heard over the past few weeks. Marilyn's confidence cracked. She tried to argue again, but the officers weren't interested. They explained, calmly and clearly, that misusing emergency services was serious, that accusations of fraud carry consequences. That authority has limits, and those limits had been crossed. For the first time since I'd met her, Marilyn looked small. The slideshow behind her still glowed on the wall, frozen mid-slide, irrelevant now. The papers she had dismissed moments earlier had become the only thing that mattered. The officers handed the binder back to me and turned to the room. "There's nothing further for us to do here," the older one said. "But I'd strongly advise everyone to respect the documented boundaries moving forward." They left as quietly as they'd arrived. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't tense anymore. It was awkward. Heavy. The kind of silence that comes when a story collapses under the weight of reality. People started talking in low voices. Questions bubbled up. Eyes drifted toward Marilyn, then away. Support evaporated in real time. The authority she'd projected so confidently had nowhere to stand. Someone on the HOA board cleared their throat and stood. A retired attorney, quiet until now, he spoke carefully. "Given what we've just learned," he said, "this matter needs to be tabled immediately. There are potential legal implications for the association." That was the polite version of panic. Marilyn didn't say anything. She gathered her papers with shaking hands, refusing to look at anyone. The room no longer belonged to her. It hadn't for a while. As people filed out, a few stopped to look at the binder. Some apologized quietly. Others just nodded, embarrassed. The narrative had flipped completely. In the span of one meeting, Marilyn went from unquestioned enforcer to liability. Her authority didn't fade, it collapsed. And there was no putting it back together. The moment the officers left, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. The urgency Marilyn had spent weeks manufacturing evaporated, replaced by something far more dangerous for her liability. The HOA board members looked at one another, eyes wide, faces tight, realizing all at once that they weren't dealing with a noisy homeowner anymore. They were dealing with a paper trail that could cost them real money. The retired attorney on the board took control quickly. His voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably serious. He explained that the association needed to stop all discussion immediately and reconvene privately. Not later that night, not after questions. Immediately. The meeting was adjourned without ceremony. No vote, no debate. Just damage control. People lingered in the hallway afterward, whispering in clusters. The tone had flipped. Where there had once been curiosity and judgment, there was now discomfort. A few neighbors approached me quietly. Some apologized outright. Others admitted they had assumed Marilyn knew what she was talking about. They hadn't meant harm. They just hadn't questioned authority. Marilyn didn't stay. She gathered her things and left through a side door, avoiding the crowd. The confidence she had carried into the meeting never made it out with her. In its place was silence. No dramatic exit. No final speech, just retreat. Over the next few days, the change became unmistakable. The letters stopped arriving. My mailbox stayed empty of threats and warnings. No new deadlines. No fines. No bold red stamps. The sudden absence of pressure was almost unsettling at first, like the calm after a storm when you're still braced for thunder that never comes. Online, the shift was even more obvious. The HOA Facebook posts disappeared. Entire threads vanished overnight, as if they had never existed. Photos were removed, comments erased. The emergency meeting announcement was quietly deleted without explanation. It was clear the board had realized that everything Marilyn had put in writing was now a liability. Erasing it wouldn't change what happened, but it might limit how far it could spread. Weeks passed with no contact. Then, through the kind of quiet neighborhood gossip that travels faster than official notices, I learned what had happened behind closed doors. The board had conducted a no-confidence vote. Not public, not announced. Just a necessary step to protect the association from further exposure. The vote was unanimous. Marilyn was removed from her position. There was no announcement to the community. No explanation, no apology issued on her behalf. She simply stopped showing up. The morning patrols ended. The clipboard disappeared. Her name stopped coming up in conversations altogether, as if the neighborhood had collectively agreed to pretend she'd never held that much power in the first place. That silence was intentional. The board also began quietly revising procedures. New language appeared in emails reminding residents about jurisdiction boundaries. Enforcement guidelines were clarified. Authority was suddenly defined very carefully, not because they'd found religion, but because they had come within inches of a lawsuit they couldn't afford. As for me, life settled back into something close to normal. The pool went back to being just a pool. Kids splashed, music played. Evenings stretched longer. The tension that had once hung over my backyard lifted completely. I didn't have to check my mailbox with a knot in my stomach anymore. I didn't have to wonder what new claim might appear online overnight. Neighbors treated me differently too, not with fear, but with a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. Some stopped by to talk. One brought a six-pack as a wordless apology. Others asked questions, not about the pool, but about how to protect themselves if something like this ever happened to them. I told them the truth. This wasn't about being clever or aggressive. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about knowing where authority ends and refusing to surrender ground you never agreed to give up. Marilyn never confronted me again. I saw her once months later driving past without slowing down. No clipboard. No stare. Just another person passing through a neighborhood she no longer controlled. And that was the real ending. Not a dramatic confrontation. Not revenge. Just the quiet removal of someone who mistook confidence for power and learned, too late, that paper carries more weight than intimidation. The storm didn't end with thunder. It ended with silence. And sometimes, that's the most satisfying victory of all. Today, my backyard is quiet again. The water sits still in the early evening, broken only by the sound of my kids laughing and the splash of a forgotten pool toy drifting across the surface. The only clipboard I see now is my kids' homework floating on a pool chair, weighted down with a pair of goggles so it doesn't blow away. That piece didn't come from shouting louder or threatening back. It came from understanding something Marilyn never did. She taught me a lesson, not about HOAs, but about bullies. Authority only works as long as people believe in it. The moment facts enter the room, false power starts to crumble. Confidence without jurisdiction is just noise, and noise can't survive contact with the truth. I didn't win by arguing online. I didn't win by making a scene. I won by documenting. Paperwork doesn't panic. It doesn't get emotional. It doesn't care who's loudest or who has the most supporters. It just exists, quietly, waiting for the moment someone finally asks the right question. And when that moment comes, everything changes. If you're ever dealing with someone who claims control over something they don't legally own, don't rush to fight them on their terms. Slow down. Gather records. Know your boundaries. Because when authority is real, it can prove itself. And when it isn't, it collapses the second the evidence shows up. That binder still sits on a shelf in my house. I hope I never need it again. But if I do, I know exactly what it can do. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?